That morning, the man I welcomed into my home slapped me across the face, and I chose silence. By nightfall, I had prepared a banquet fit for a king. My daughter smiled in relief, thinking I had finally accepted my place as the servant. She whispered, "Finally, Dad understands." But she didn't know who was sitting at the head of the table, nor that the main course wasn't roast beef, but cold, hard justice. If you've ever felt betrayed by your own blood, take a deep breath, because this story might be the therapy you need. Before I tell you how I served my revenge on a silver platter, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps this old man share his truth. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love reading your answers. The sound of porcelain shattering against the marble floor was like a gunshot in the quiet morning. I stood, frozen in this kitchen, my arthritic hands shaking, staring at the fragments of the antique blue and white platter. It was just a plate. An expensive one, sure, but just a plate. I bent down to pick up the pieces. My knees popped with the effort of 75 years of hard work. I didn't hear him come in. I only felt the rush of air before the impact. Jason, my son-in-law, didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask if I had cut myself. He lunged across the kitchen island and swung his open palm with all the force of a man half my age. The slap connected dead center with my left cheek. The force of the blow sent my reading glasses skidding across the floor and shoved me backward against the refrigerator. My head spun. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth where my tooth had caught my lip. I looked up, dazed, to see Jason towering over me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, absolute rage. He was wearing his $3,000 Italian suit, the one I knew he bought on credit, and his eyes were wild. "You useless old parasite," he hissed, spit flying from his lips. "Do you have any idea how much that plate cost? That antique was worth more than your entire miserable existence." I touched my cheek. It burned. I looked at this man, a man I had welcomed into my family, a man whose debts I had paid. And I said nothing. I just stared at him. My silence seemed to infuriate him even more. He stepped closer, raising his hand again, as if he were going to strike me a second time. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, Henry," he yelled. "You live under my roof. You eat my food. The least you can do is not destroy my property with your clumsy shaking hands under this roof." The irony was so sharp it felt like a physical stab to the gut. But before I could speak, before I could remind him exactly whose money had paid for this roof, for the marble floors he was standing on, and for the very suit he was wearing, I heard footsteps rushing down the stairs. It was Sarah, my daughter, my little girl. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Sarah would stop this. Sarah, who I raised alone after her mother died when she was just 6 years old. Sarah, who I worked double shifts for in my workshop, breathing in sawdust and varnish for 40 years so she could have piano lessons and a college degree. She ran into the kitchen, her eyes wide, but she didn't run to me. She didn't look at the blooming red mark on her 75-year-old father's face. She didn't look at the blood on my lip. She ran straight for the broken porcelain on the floor. "Oh no, oh no," she gasped, dropping to her knees to inspect the shards. "Jason, honey, is this the Ming platter, the one from the auction?" "It's gone, Sarah," Jason said, dropping his voice to a fake exhausted tone, playing the victim instantly. Your father decided to wash the dishes again, even though I've told him 1,000 times to leave the expensive things to the maid. Sarah stood up and turned to me. Her expression wasn't one of concern, it was annoyance, pure, exhausted annoyance. "Dad, why?" she asked, her voice high and whiny. "Why do you always have to touch things? You know Jason is under a lot of pressure with the new merger. You know he's stressed. Why do you have to provoke him like this in the morning?" I looked at her. I really looked at her. I searched for the little girl who used to cry when I got a splinter in my finger. She wasn't there. Standing in front of me was a woman, terrified of her husband. A woman who had learned to trade her dignity for a lifestyle she couldn't afford. "He hit me, Sarah," I said, my voice raspy. "He slapped me." Sarah flinched, but she didn't turn on him. She looked at her shoes, then at the wall. "Anywhere but me." "You probably startled him, Dad," she muttered, wringing her hands. "You know he has a short temper when he's stressed. Just please go to your room. Don't make this worse. We have the dinner tonight." My room meant the guest bedroom on the first floor, the one next to the laundry room, the one that used to be a storage closet before they realized they needed a place to stick me. I straightened up. My cheek throbbed, but my mind was suddenly clearer than it had been in years. For 2 years I had been living in a fog of grief and confusion. 2 years ago, Jason had come to me crying, saying he made a bad investment, that he was going to lose everything, that Sarah would be out on the street. He needed $50,000. I didn't have that kind of cash on hand. But I had my house. The house in the old neighborhood where Sarah grew up. The house I built with my own 2 hands, modifying it for 30 years until it was perfect. I sold it. I sold my sanctuary to save them. I gave them the money thinking I was saving my daughter's future. They invited me to live with them in their new mansion in the suburbs. They said, "Dad, you'll never have to worry about anything again. This is your home too." But it wasn't my home. I was the unpaid butler, the babysitter, the scapegoat, and now I was the punching bag. Jason adjusted his tie, regaining his composure. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes. "Clean up this mess, Henry," he said, "and stay out of sight today. I have important people coming over tonight. Mr. Vance from the investment fund is coming for dinner. If this deal finally goes through, I'll be free of all these headaches." He looked at Sarah. "Make sure he doesn't embarrass us." I watched him grab his car keys and walk out the door without looking back. The front door slammed shut, shaking the house. Sarah looked at me, tears finally welling in her eyes. But they were tears of self-pity, not empathy. "Dad, please," she whispered, "just stay in your room tonight. I'll bring you a plate later." I looked at the broken plate. I looked at my daughter, who was so broken inside she couldn't even see it. And something in me shifted. The old Henry, the one who just wanted to keep the peace, the one who thought love meant sacrificing your dignity. That man died in that kitchen right alongside the blue and white porcelain. I pulled a handkerchief from my pocket to wipe the blood from my lip. I folded it carefully and put it away. "No, Sarah," I said. My voice was calm, eerily calm. "What?" she asked, confused. I said no. I'm not staying in my room. Jason has an important guest. AVIP. Yes, Mr. Vance is life or death for Jason. That's why he's so on edge. "Good," I said. "Then we should celebrate properly. You look tired, sweetheart. Your hands are shaking. Go rest. I'll handle dinner tonight." "Dad, you don't have to," she started. "I insist. I cut in, walking past her toward the pantry. "I'll make my special beef bourguignon. It's a celebration dish. Slow-cooked beef, red wine mushrooms. It'll be a meal Jason will never forget." Sarah looked at me, searching for signs of anger, waiting for the explosion she assumed was coming. But she only saw a flat, calm surface. She exhaled in relief. She thought I had given up. She thought I was trying to make up for breaking the plate. "Okay, Dad," she said, kissing my cheek, avoiding the side Jason had hit. "That would be helpful. Thank you. Just, please, make it perfect." I watched her walk up the stairs to prepare for her day of leisure, leaving her 75-year-old father to clean up the mess her husband had made. "Perfect. Perfect," I whispered to the empty kitchen. "Oh, don't worry. It will be absolutely perfect." I grabbed the dustpan and swept up the shards of the plate. As I tossed them in the trash, I caught my reflection in the window. The red mark on my cheek was turning purple. My white hair was disheveled. I looked like a victim, but as I stared at myself, I straightened my spine. I wasn't just a retired carpenter. I wasn't just a clumsy old man. I was Henry Sterling. And what Jason and Sarah didn't know, what they had never bothered to ask in all these years, was that before I was a carpenter, I was a sergeant in the Marine Infantry. I knew how to hold a position, I knew how to gather intel, and I knew how to strike when the enemy least expected it. I walked over to the calendar on the fridge. Tonight, 7 p.m., dinner with Mr. Vance. I grabbed my coat and the keys to my truck. I had shopping to do. But I wasn't going to the grocery store. Not yet. First, I had a stop to make at the lockers in the central train station. I had a file waiting for me there. A file I had commissioned a private investigator to put together 3 months ago. When I first noticed Jason whispering on the phone at 2 in the morning, I had hesitated to open it. I had been afraid of what I might find. I had wanted to believe there was still hope for this family. But that slap was the seal on the warrant. I backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching over the gravel. Merging onto the highway toward the city, I felt a strange sensation. It wasn't pain. It wasn't sadness. It was the cold, sharp clarity of a man who has nothing left to lose. Tonight, I would serve dinner. I would serve the best meal they had ever tasted, and for dessert, I would serve the truth. But first, I needed to see exactly how deep the rot went. I needed to know why a man who claimed to be a financial genius was so desperate for cash that he would hit an old man over a plate. I drove into the city, my jaw tight, my plan forming. The investigation was about to end, and the execution was about to begin. If you think you know where this is going, trust me, you don't. Because what I found in that locker wasn't just about gambling debts or affairs. It was something much, much worse. Something that threatened not just my bank account, but the safety of my grandson, Leo. And that was a line they never should have crossed. The city wind cut through my coat as I stepped out of my truck near Central Station. It was a biting chill that usually made my joints ache, but today I felt nothing. Adrenaline is a powerful painkiller. I wasn't here to buy organic vegetables or artisan bread for dinner. I was here to pick up the ammo that would end the war my son-in-law had started this morning. The station was packed with the midday rush, a sea of commuters with their heads down, hurrying to their next destination. I moved through them like a ghost. To them, I was just another old man in a worn canvas jacket, probably on his way to visit family, or maybe just looking for a warm place to sit. That was the advantage of being 75. You become invisible. People stop seeing the man and only see the age. Jason certainly had. To him, I was a piece of furniture, an old, dusty, easily disposable piece of furniture. I headed for the lockers near the north exit. Leaning against a pillar, reading a newspaper, like we were back in Berlin in the 80s, was Joe. We had served together in the Marines. While I went into woodworking, Joe went into intelligence and later private security. He was the only person in the world who knew the full extent of my life, the parts I kept hidden even from Sarah. He didn't wave. He just folded the newspaper, picked up a thick manila envelope from the bench beside him, and walked toward me. As we crossed paths, the handoff was flawless. No words exchanged, just a brief, grim nod. I saw the look in his eyes. It was the same look he gave me 40 years ago when we realized our platoon was walking into an ambush. It was a look that said, "Brace yourself, Henry. It's worse than you think." I took the envelope and walked to a quiet corner of the station, finding an empty bench facing the grand concourse. I didn't open it right away. I just held it, feeling the weight of the paper. This envelope contained the last 3 months of Jason's life, his movements, his bank accounts, his secrets. I looked up at the high, vaulted ceiling of the station. My eyes drifted to an ad for high-end furniture hanging from the rafters. It was an ad for Vance Interiors, featuring a handcrafted executive desk. A bitter smile touched my lips. Jason loved that brand. He bragged endlessly about the Vance chairs in his home office, about how they represented status and power. He had lectured me once, explaining that I wouldn't understand the quality of such things because I was just a simple carpenter who fixed fences. The irony was so rich, it almost made me laugh out loud in the middle of the station. Jason didn't know. Sarah didn't know. Nobody knew. I wasn't just a carpenter. I was the founder of Sterling Heritage, the very company that had designed and built the prototypes for that furniture line. I had started it in a garage with nothing but a set of chisels and an obsession with perfection. Over 30 years, I built it into a top-tier manufacturing empire. 10 years ago, when the Vance Group approached me with a buyout offer, I took it. I sold the company for a sum that would make Jason's knees buckle. But I had conditions. I kept a 15% stake in preferred shares and retained a permanent seat on the advisory board with veto power over design quality. I had walked away from the CEO title, but I hadn't walked away from the power. I kept it a secret from Sarah. It was the hardest decision of my life. But I had seen too many children of my wealthy friends turn into useless, entitled parasites, waiting for their parents to die so they could cash in. I wanted Sarah to build her own character. I wanted her to find a partner who loved her for her, not for the millions her father had in a trust fund. I thought I was teaching her independence. I thought I was protecting her soul. Instead, I watched her marry a man who treated money like a god and people like disposable tools. I watched her shrink herself to fit into his materialistic world. I had sat on my fortune, living in their guest room, enduring their disrespect, waiting to be shown a spark of decency. I kept waiting for Sarah to stand up for me, or for Jason to show a moment of genuine gratitude. I realized now that my test had failed. Or maybe it had succeeded in showing me exactly who they were. I looked at the envelope in my hands. My thumb traced the seal. "You call me a parasite, Jason," I thought, gripping the paper. "You think I'm a drain on your resources. You have no idea that the only reason your firm, the one you claim to be a big shot at, secured that contract last year was because I made a phone call to the board. I saved you, and you didn't even know it. But the bailout ends today. I was no longer Henry the old carpenter. I wasn't the father-in-law who needed a place to stay. I was the majority shareholder. I was the man who could pick up a phone and end careers. And now, thanks to Joe, I was the man who knew where the bodies were buried. I tore the envelope open. The sound of the paper ripping echoed in my ears like the first shot from a firing squad. I pulled out the first document. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a termination letter. My eyes scanned the page and the chill in my chest spread. It was dated 6 months ago. Jason hadn't just made a bad investment. He hadn't just hit a rough patch. He had been fired. Terminated for cause. I flipped to the next page and the picture grew clearer and darker. Massive gambling debts, but not just to casinos. There were names here that didn't belong in corporate ledgers, names that belonged in police files. I sat there in the middle of Central Station, surrounded by strangers, and realized my son-in-law wasn't just a jerk, he was a criminal. And he had dragged my daughter and grandson into the middle of a shark tank. I shoved the papers back into the envelope and stood up. My knees didn't pop this time. I walked toward the exit with long, purposeful strides. I had a dinner to cook and a guest list to update. Jason wanted to impress Mr. Vance tonight. He wanted to close a deal to save his own skin. Well, he was going to get his meeting with Mr. Vance, but he wasn't going to like the agenda. I stepped out into the freezing city air, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel the cold. I felt the fire. It was time to go home. It was time to set the table. I sat in the cab of my truck with the engine running to keep the heater fighting against the bitter frost. The windows started to fog up, isolating me from the outside world, creating a small, private confession booth where I was forced to confront my family's sins. I pulled the rest of the documents out of the envelope Joe had given me. My hands were steady now, but my stomach churned with a mix of disgust and cold fury. The termination letter I'd seen in the station was just the tip of the iceberg. As I flipped through the pages of the forensic accounting report Joe's team had compiled, the image of Jason as a stressed but competent businessman dissolved entirely. He wasn't a financial wizard suffering from a market downturn. He was a common thief. The report detailed months of petty embezzlement from his old firm. He had been inflating expense accounts, siphoning client funds to pay the leases on his luxury cars, and falsifying commission reports. They hadn't let him go because of downsizing. He'd been fired for cause, and he was lucky they hadn't prosecuted him yet. They probably kept it quiet to avoid a scandal just kicking him out the door. But unemployment hadn't stopped his spending. The next section of the file was a list of debts that made my eyes water. They weren't just credit cards, although those were maxed out to the tune of $50,000. It was the other names on the list that made my blood run cold. These weren't banks. They were names associated with loan sharks who operated out of the back rooms of dive bars. Jason owed nearly $500,000 to people who didn't send past due notices. They sent men with baseball bats. That explained the desperation. That explained the terror I had seen in his eyes right before he slapped me. He wasn't just stressed about a merger. He was fighting for his life. I reached into the envelope and found a small black flash drive taped to a piece of cardstock. Joe had written a simple note underneath. Car audio. 3 days ago. I plugged the drive into the USB port of my truck's media system. The audio crackled to life. It was the sound of a car engine humming, followed by the familiar, arrogant voice of my son-in-law. He was on the phone, probably using the hands-free system. "Listen to me," he was saying, his voice tight with panic. "The meeting is set for Friday night. Vance is coming to the house. I'm going to sell him on the high yield fund. It's essentially a Ponzi scheme, but he won't know that until the ink is dry. I just need his signature and the initial transfer. Once that money hits my account, I pay you. I swear." My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. He was planning to defraud Mr. Vance. He was planning to steal from the very man who owned the company I built. The audacity was staggering. But the recording wasn't over. There was a pause, and then Jason spoke again, his voice lower, more sinister. "This time, yes. The house is the collateral. I know, but the old man still lives there. It complicates the sale." He doesn't listen. "I have a plan for him. After dinner, once I secure the deal with Vance, we're moving, Henry. There's a state facility on the outskirts, Greenview or something like that. It's cheap, smells like bleach and despair, but it's affordable. I'm working on the paperwork to have him declared incompetent. He's 75. Who is the court going to believe? A successful CFO or a senile old carpenter?" I stopped breathing. The air in the truck seemed to vanish. Greenview. I knew that place. It was a warehouse for the forgotten, a place where the elderly were drugged into submission and left to rot in soiled sheets. That was his plan for me. That was my reward for saving his family. He wasn't just going to kick me out. He was going to strip me of my rights, label me insane, and lock me away so he could sell the roof over my head to pay his gambling debts. The recording continued. "Once he's out of the way, we list the house. It should be enough to cover the rest of the shark loan. Sarah won't fight me on it. She does what I tell her. She's too scared of losing her lifestyle to care about her dad." The audio cut off. Silence returned to the truck, heavy and suffocating. I stared out the windshield at the grey parking lot. A tear slipped from my eye, hot and angry. It wasn't for me. It was for Sarah. It was him. He spoke about her with such contempt, such absolute certainty of her weakness. And the worst part was, he was right. She had watched him hit me and blamed me for breaking a plate. I wiped the tear away roughly. My sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that felt like steel in my spine. Jason thought he was playing chess. He thought I was a pawn to be sacrificed to save his king. He thought he could defraud Mr. Vance, a man who respected me more than my own family did. He had no idea that the king he was trying to hustle was already in checkmate. I ejected the flash drive and tucked it carefully into my pocket. This wasn't just evidence. This was the nail in his coffin. I had heard enough. I didn't need to know anything else. The man sitting at my table tonight wasn't just a failure. He was a predator. And predators needed to be put down. I started the truck, the engine roaring to life. I had a dinner to prep. I had to buy the best cuts of meat, the freshest mushrooms, the most expensive wine. Everything had to be perfect. Because tonight, Jason wasn't just losing a deal. He was losing his freedom. And I was going to be the one to open the door for the cops. I pulled out of the parking lot, my eyes dry and focused. I was going to cook the meal of a lifetime. It would be a last supper for the life Jason knew. And as for the nursing home, I thought as I merged into traffic, the only person going to a state facility was him. And it wouldn't be a home, it would be a federal prison. I pulled the chef's knife from the block. It felt heavy and balanced in my hand. I had a dinner to cook, and I had a rat to trap. I turned the knife over, watching the light catch the steel edge. The anger that had been a hot fire in my chest settled into something colder, something solid and unbreakable, like ice on a lake. Jason had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he could bully an old man into silence. He thought his threats were the ultimate power in this house. He didn't realize that by threatening Leo, he had activated a part of me I had buried since my days in the service. I was no longer just a grandfather. I was a protector. And the threat was sitting in my living room, probably pouring himself a drink, thinking he had won. I started prepping the vegetables for the beef bourguignon. The rhythmic chopping of the carrots and onions was soothing. Chop, chop, chop. Every cut was precise. Every movement calculated. I wasn't just making a stew. I was building a trap. The smell of searing meat and red wine began to fill the kitchen. A rich, comforting scent that masked the impending doom. As I cooked, I formulated the final steps of my plan. I needed to make sure that when the hammer fell, there was no escape route, no way for Jason to spin this, no way for him to blame stress or a misunderstanding. I needed absolute, undeniable proof, broadcast in real time. I remembered the small spy cameras I had installed weeks ago. I had put one in the study and one in the living room, hidden inside the smoke detectors. I had hesitated to use them, feeling like a paranoid old man invading his family's privacy. But now I thanked God for that paranoia. I wiped my hands on a towel and pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I opened the app linked to the cameras. The feed from the study was dark, but the audio was crystal clear. I could hear Jason pacing. I could hear him muttering to himself, rehearsing his pitch for Mr. Vance. Then I heard the door open. Sarah's voice drifted through the speaker. "Jason, please." She sounded exhausted. "Dad is cooking dinner. Can't you just be nice tonight? Just for a few hours?" "Nice." Jason's voice was a sneer. "I'll be nice when that old man is out of my house. Do you know what Vance told me last week? He asked about my assets. He wants to know I have liquidity before he signs. If your father doesn't sign those papers declaring himself incompetent next week, we are dead in the water. I need control of his accounts, Sarah. I need to liquidate his portfolio to cover the buy-in." "But the house," Sarah whispered. "You said selling the house would be enough." "It's not enough," Jason yelled, and I saw Sarah flinch on the grainy video feed. "The house covers the debt to the investors, but I need operating capital. Your father has money sitting in that retirement account doing nothing. He's senile. He doesn't need it. We do." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. He wasn't just planning to send me to a home. He was planning to drain every cent I had left, leaving me destitute in a state facility while he played big shot with my life savings. And he was bullying my daughter into being an accomplice. "Sarah, listen to me." Jason's voice dropped to a manipulative purr. "I'm doing this for us, for Leo. Do you want Leo to grow up poor? Do you want him to be a nobody, like your father?" "Don't talk about him like that," Sarah said weakly. "I'll talk about him however I want. He's a burden. And after tonight, if Vance signs, we move forward. I have the papers drawn up. Dr. Evans owes me a favor. He'll sign the competency eval without even seeing the old man. By Monday, Henry will be a ward of the state, and we'll be free." I set the phone down on the counter. My hand was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of the evil I was witnessing. He had a doctor in his pocket. He had a plan to legally erase me. This wasn't just greed. It was a conspiracy. I turned back to the stove, added the pearl onions and mushrooms to the pot. I poured in the rest of the wine, let it simmer, let the flavors meld. I left the kitchen and walked upstairs to the guest room. I needed to get the file I'd retrieved from the train station. I needed to make sure I was ready. I opened my suitcase and pulled out the manila envelope. I also pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was my Medal of Honor. I hadn't worn it in 50 years. I had kept it hidden, a relic from a past life. But tonight, I was going to wear it, not to show off, but to remind myself who I was, to remind myself that I had faced men with guns and survived. A coward like Jason didn't stand a chance. I pinned the medal to the inside pocket of my suit jacket, a secret talisman. Then I went to Leo's room. He was sitting on his bed with his headphones on, drawing in a sketchbook. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes wide and fearful. "Grandpa, everything is going to be okay, Leo. I promise." He looked at my face. "You fixed it." "I'm fixing it right now," I said. "Listen to me. Tonight, during dinner, I want you to stay in your room. No matter what you hear, no matter how loud it gets, don't come downstairs. Understand?" He nodded. "Dad's gonna be mad. Dad's gonna be busy," I said carefully. "You just draw. Draw me a lion, a big, strong lion. Can you do that?" He smiled, a small, tentative thing. "Okay, Grandpa." I hugged him one last time, feeling the fragility of his little body. I would burn the whole world down to keep him safe. I went back downstairs. The clock on the wall read 6:30. Mr. Vance would be here in 30 minutes. The stage was set. The players were in position. The trap was primed. I walked into the dining room and started setting the table. I didn't use the everyday plates. I went to the china cabinet and pulled out the good stuff, the Wedgwood porcelain that had belonged to my late wife. I polished the silverware until it gleamed. I set out the crystal wine glasses. I set 3 places. One for Jason at the head of the table, one for Mr. Vance to his right, one for Sarah to his left. And then I set a 4th place, directly opposite Jason at the other end of the table. Jason walked into the dining room, adjusting his cufflinks. He stopped when he saw the 4th place setting. "What is that?" he snapped. "Who is that for?" I looked him in the eye, my face a mask of calm servitude. "I thought I might join you, sir, just to ensure the service is flawless." He let out a cruel laugh, a sound like a bark. "You join us? Don't be ridiculous. Clear that away. You eat in the kitchen." I didn't move. "Mr. Vance is a man of the people," I said smoothly. "He might find it strange if the help isn't treated with respect." Jason hesitated. He was nervous. He didn't want anything throwing off his rhythm. "Fine," he hissed. "Sit there, but keep your mouth shut. If you say one word, Henry, one word other than 'more wine,' I swear to God." He let the threat hang in the air. He didn't need to finish it. We both knew what he meant. The doorbell rang. Jason jumped, smoothed his jacket, took a deep breath, and put on his mask. The mask of the charming, successful businessman. "Showtime," he whispered to himself. He walked toward the front door. I stayed in the dining room, standing by my chair. I heard the door open. I heard the jovial greetings. "Mr. Vance, so glad you could make it. Welcome to my humble home. And this must be your assistant. A pleasure to meet you." I heard the footsteps approaching the dining room. I took a deep breath. The door swung open. Jason walked in, gesturing grandly toward the table. "Please, have a seat. My father-in-law has prepared a simple stew. I hope you don't mind." Mr. Vance walked in. He was a tall, silver-haired man, radiating authority. Beside him was a woman I recognized instantly, even though Jason clearly didn't. She wasn't an assistant. Mr. Vance's eyes swept the room. They landed on the table, they landed on the food, and then they landed on me. He stopped dead in his tracks. His mouth parted slightly. The polite smile vanished, replaced by a look of absolute shock. He didn't look at Jason. He walked right past him, straight toward me. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice thick with reverence. "Henry, is that you?" Jason froze. His smile faltered. "You know my father-in-law," Jason stammered. Mr. Vance ignored him. He reached out and took my hand, shaking it firmly. "My God, sir, I haven't seen you since the board meeting in Zurich 5 years ago. I thought you were retired in Tuscany. What on earth are you doing here?" I smiled a slow, cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I'm serving dinner, Mr. Vance, and I believe we have a lot to discuss." Jason looked from me to Vance, the colour draining from his face. The realization that something was terribly, terribly wrong began to dawn on him, but he had no idea that the dinner bell wasn't ringing for a meal. It was ringing for his execution. The heavy cast-iron pot sat on the centre burner, radiating a steady, reliable heat against the cold draft seeping in from the hallway. I poured a little oil into the pot, watching it shimmer and dance as it came to temperature. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a ritual. Beef bourguignon had been Sarah's favourite dish since she was a little girl with missing front teeth and pigtails. I remembered her sitting at the old pine table in our kitchen in the old neighbourhood, her feet swinging, waiting impatiently for the stew that smelled like patience and love. She used to say it tasted like a hug. Tonight I was going to give her a hug. But I was also going to burn her world to the ground so I could build a better one from the ashes. I picked up the cubes of beef I had carefully dried with paper towels. You have to dry the meat to get a good sear. If it's wet, it just steams and you lose that deep, complex flavour. It's a detail most people overlook because they're in a rush. Jason was like wet meat. No substance, no sear, just a lot of steam and noise. I dropped the beef into the hot oil in batches. The sound was aggressive, violent even. The smell of browning meat instantly filled the kitchen, a primal, savoury aroma that usually promised comfort. As the meat browned, I pulled my phone from my pocket and set it on the granite counter next to the cutting board. It buzzed silently. A text message from Joe. "The asset is in place. She'll arrive with Vance." I smiled, flipping a piece of meat with my tongs. The asset was Agent Emily Turner, a forensic accountant who had been working with the FBI on a task force investigating the very loan sharks Jason was indebted to. Joe had pulled some strings, old favours from our service days, to get her assigned to this meeting. She wasn't just going to pose as Vance's associate. She was going to be the witness to a federal crime. I typed a quick reply with my free hand. "Copy that. The trap is set." I removed the browned meat and set it aside. Now the vegetables. I added the pearl onions and carrots to the pot, letting them sweat in the rendered fat. The rhythm of the knife hitting the cutting board earlier had been the war drum. Now the simmering pot was the waiting game. I looked at the bottle of red wine standing on the counter. A robust, earthy Pinot Noir. Jason probably would have chosen something flashy and expensive that tasted like oak chips. I pulled the cork and poured the whole bottle into the pot, deglazing the fond from the bottom. The steam rose, carrying the scent of grapes and earth. It was intoxicating. As the wine reduced, I checked my email on my phone. My lawyer, Mr. Hernandez, had sent the final draft of the trust documents. I had instructed him to set up an irrevocable trust for Leo, funded by the dividends from my hidden shares in Vance's company. The house, once I reclaimed it from the bank after exposing Jason's fraud, would go into that trust. Sarah would have a roof over her head, but she wouldn't own a single brick. She couldn't be trusted with the property. Not yet. She had to learn that security wasn't something you married. It was something you built. I scrolled down the legal document, my eyes scanning the clauses. Removal of guardianship in the event of criminal negligence. That was the clause that would keep Leo safe. If Jason went down and Sarah faltered, I would step in, legally, irrevocably. I confirmed the document with a tap of my finger. Sent. The wine was bubbling, reducing to a syrup. I added the meat back in, along with the beef broth, tomato paste, and a bouquet of fresh parsley, thyme and bay leaves tied with kitchen twine. I covered the pot and turned the heat down to the faintest whisper of a flame. Now I just needed time. 3 hours of slow, gentle heat to break down the tough fibers of the meat and turn them into something tender and melting. It was a perfect metaphor for what I was doing to Jason. I wasn't going to rush it. I wasn't going to yell or scream. I was going to apply constant, relentless pressure until he fell apart. The kitchen was warm now, filled with a complex aroma that felt like home. It was a lie, of course. This house wasn't a home. It was a showroom for Jason's ego, an empty shell paid for with stolen money and my retirement fund. But for tonight, the smell would fool them. It would lull them into a false sense of security. They would smell the meat and the wine and think of family dinners and celebrations. They wouldn't smell the smoke from the bridge I was burning. I washed my hands, scrubbing the smell of onions from my skin. I checked the clock. 6:15 p.m. I had 45 minutes before the curtain went up. My phone buzzed again. Another notification. This one was from my bank. A transfer alert. Jason had tried to access my emergency savings account using the power of attorney he had forged last week. The transaction had been flagged and blocked because I'd frozen the account this morning. I laughed softly. He was desperate. He was checking the cushions for loose change while the Titanic was sinking. He must be in his office right now, staring at an access denied screen, sweating in his expensive suit, wondering why the old man's money wasn't flowing. He would be terrified. He would be dangerous. That was good. Fear made people careless. Fear made them arrogant. He would come to this dinner thinking he had to close Vance at all costs. He would be so focused on the shark in front of him that he wouldn't see the whale surfacing beneath the boat. I dried my hands and picked up the appetizer tray I had prepared earlier. Cheese gougères. Simple, elegant, and deceptive. Air and dough, just like Jason's promises. I walked toward the swinging door that led to the dining room. I stopped for a moment, listening to the silence of the house. Upstairs, Leo was drawing lions. In the master bedroom, Sarah was probably trying to cover the red circles around her eyes with makeup. And in the study, Jason was frantically trying to figure out which lie would save him. I pushed the door open. It was time to set the stage. The food was cooking, the evidence was gathered, the guests were on their way, and the chef was ready to serve the most expensive meal this family had ever eaten. It wouldn't cost money. It would cost them everything they thought they knew about me. The front door opened with a force that vibrated through the floorboards, shattering the calm focus I had maintained in the kitchen. Heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood of the hallway, erratic and rushed. Jason was home. He didn't greet his wife or his son. He marched straight into the kitchen, the nerve center of his anxiety for the night. When he pushed through the swinging door, he looked like a man whose internal wiring was starting to fray. His tie was loosened, hanging crooked around a neck that was damp with sweat, despite the freezing temperature outside. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around the room, as if expecting to find a disaster. He didn't look at me like a person. He looked at me like a potential liability, a loose screw in a machine he barely knew how to operate. He walked over to the stove and lifted the lid off the cast iron pot, not using a pot holder. When the steam hit his hand, he slammed it back down, the metallic clatter jarring against the quiet simmer. "Is it ready?" he snapped, not bothering to look at me. "It's resting," I replied, my voice steady and low. "It needs 20 minutes to settle before serving. The flavors need to marry." He spun around, his face tight with a mix of arrogance and terror. "I don't give a damn about the flavors marrying, Henry. I care about timing. Mr. Vance is very punctual. If this dinner is late, if the meat is tough, if the wine is corked, I will hold you personally responsible." He walked over to the counter where I had left the bottle of Pinot Noir to breathe. He picked it up, inspecting the label with a critical, dismissive sneer. It was a vintage bottle from my own collection, one I had salvaged from my cellar before I sold the house. It was worth more than his monthly car payment. "At least you didn't buy that cheap swill," he muttered, setting it back down. "Listen to me closely, old man. Tonight is not a family dinner. This is business, high-level business. Mr. Vance isn't just a guest. He's the key to my future, to our future." He stepped closer, invading my personal space. The smell of stale coffee and nervous sweat radiated off him. He poked a finger into my chest, tapping against my sternum where my heart beat slow and strong. "You are going to serve the food. You are going to pour the wine, and then you are going to fade into the background. Understood? I don't want you telling your boring stories about sawdust and wood shavings. I don't want you trying to be charming." I looked down at his finger, then up into his eyes. I didn't blink. I didn't back away. "I understand perfectly, Jason," I said. He wasn't finished. The fear inside him was making him cruel, needing to exert dominance to calm his own panic. "If you embarrass me tonight, Henry, if you open your mouth and say a single word that jeopardizes this deal, the nursing home will look like a luxury resort compared to where I'll send you. I'll leave you on the street with nothing but the clothes on your back. Do not test me." It was a direct threat, delivered with the venom of a cornered animal. He thought he was breaking me. He thought he was securing my obedience through fear. He had no idea he was talking to a man who had already dismantled his entire life on paper and was just waiting to strike the match. I picked up a towel and wiped my hands slowly. My movements were deliberate. I stared right back into his eyes, letting a tiny, cryptic smile touch my lips. It wasn't a smile of submission. It was the smile of a judge watching a guilty man commit perjury. "You have nothing to worry about," I said softly. I will serve exactly what you deserve." Jason paused, frowning, trying to decipher my tone. For a split second, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He sensed something was wrong, a shift in the air pressure, but his arrogance quickly smothered his intuition. He scoffed, smoothing his jacket and running a hand through his thinning hair. "Just do your job," he spat. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the kitchen, barking a name into his phone before the door even swung shut. I watched him go. He was walking toward his execution, with his chest puffed out, convinced he was the king of the castle. I turned back to the stove. The oven timer beeped softly. The appetizers were ready, golden, puffed and hollow. I pulled them out, feeling the heat wash over my face. I arranged them on a silver platter. The guests would be arriving any minute. The stage was set. Jason had given his orders. He wanted service, he wanted silence. And he wanted me to give him what he deserved. I picked up the tray. I fully intended to follow his instructions to the letter. I would give him exactly what he deserved. And I was going to make it a dish, best served cold. I waited until the heavy footsteps upstairs faded into the plush carpet of the master suite. The house fell into a tense, vibrating silence, the kind that hangs in the air before a thunderstorm breaks. I moved quickly. My movements were precise and practiced. Tonight I wasn't just a chef. I was a technician, prepping the final stage of a demolition. I stepped into the formal dining room. It was a cold, impressive space that Sarah rarely used, dominated by a massive mahogany table Jason had bought to impress clients. On the far wall, mounted above a credenza, was a huge flat-screen television. Jason liked to use it to display dynamic art or live market news during his dinners. A glowing, constant reminder of his self-perceived importance. He had bragged about the integrated smart system for weeks after installing it, mocking me when I asked how to turn the volume down. He thought I was a dinosaur, incapable of understanding anything more complex than a hammer. He had forgotten that I ran a manufacturing empire that utilized automated machinery and complex logistics software long before he learned to tie his expensive Italian shoes. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and opened the casting app Jason had set up for me. I tapped the screen, scanning for the local network. There it was. The dining room control hub. I entered the passcode Jason had generated. The screen on the wall flickered once, a barely perceptible glitch, and then returned to its idle image of a Tuscan landscape. On my phone, a small green icon appeared. Connected. I had full control. With a single tap, I could override whatever pretentious playlist Jason chose and broadcast the video evidence I had compiled. I could show Mr. Vance the footage of Jason forging signatures. I could play the audio of him planning to dump me in a state facility. I could turn this shrine to his ego into a courtroom. I slid the phone back into my pocket, making sure it was easily accessible. The digital trap was set. Now, for the physical evidence. I returned to the kitchen island where the manila envelope from the central station lay next to the flour canister. It looked harmless, just a stack of papers, but inside was the forensic accounting of a criminal life. The embezzlement records, the debts to loan sharks, the guardianship papers for the nursing home. I took the heavy silver serving tray I had polished earlier. It was meant for dessert, a final touch of elegance. I lifted the linen napkin lining the bottom and placed the thick envelope flat against the cold metal. I covered it carefully with the cloth, smoothing out the wrinkles until the surface looked immaculate. I placed the crystal bowl holding the dessert on top, flanked by delicate silver spoons. To the naked eye, It was just a tray of sweets, but beneath the cream and pastry lay Jason's arrest warrant. I would bring it out at the end of the meal, a final course he would choke on. I carried the tray into the dining room and placed it on the sideboard, right within reach of the head of the table. It sat there, gleaming under the chandelier, a silent landmine waiting for a misstep. I checked my watch. 6:55 p.m. 5 minutes to 0 hour. I could hear movement upstairs again. Jason's heavy tread, probably pacing, checking his reflection, practicing his lies. Sarah's lighter, hesitant steps, probably wiping away tears and trying to find a smile to wear as a mask. And the silence from Leo's room. My brave little boy, drawing lions to keep the fear at bay. I adjusted the collar of my shirt, feeling the cold metal of the Medal of Honor pressed against my ribs inside my jacket. It was a secret weight, a reminder of the man I used to be, and the man I needed to be tonight. I wasn't doing this out of spite. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing this to cut out a cancer that was killing my family. I stood by the window looking out at the driveway. Headlights swept across the snow-dusted lawn. A black limousine pulled up to the curb, its engine purring smoothly. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Mr. Vance had arrived, and with him, the storm. I turned my back to the window and walked to my position at the kitchen door. I crossed my hands behind my back, lowered my head slightly, and waited. The trap was armed, the bait was set, and the rat was about to walk in. The doorbell rang with a crisp electronic chime that signaled the beginning of the end. I watched from the shadows of the kitchen door as Jason transformed. His shoulders straightened, his scowl vanished, and a plastic, fawning smile plastered itself across his face. It was a masterclass in deception. He smoothed his tie one last time and pulled open the heavy oak door. "Mr. Vance," Jason boomed, his voice dripping with fake warmth. "What an honor. Thank you so much for coming out on such a cold night. Welcome to my home." Arthur Vance stepped into the foyer, bringing a gust of freezing air with him. He was a man who commanded space without trying. Tall and broad-shouldered, in a cashmere coat that probably cost more than Jason's car. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his eyes were sharp, scanning the entryway with the detached appraisal of a man who bought and sold companies for sport. Beside him was a woman who looked out of place at a business dinner, or so Jason probably thought. She was striking young, with sharp features and jet-black hair pulled back into a severe bun. She wore a black dress that was elegant but understated, clutching a slim leather portfolio. Jason's eyes lingered on her for a fraction of a second too long, a mix of appreciation and dismissal. He clearly categorized her as eye candy, a secretary, or maybe a mistress. He had no idea he was looking at a shark in high heels. "And this must be your associate," Jason said, extending a hand to her. "I'm Jason." "Emily," she replied coldly, shaking his hand with a grip that made even Jason blink. "Just Emily." "Please, come in. Let me take your coats," Jason said, buzzing around them like a nervous bellhop. Sarah appeared from the living room. Her smile was fragile and terrified. She smoothed her dress with white knuckles. "Hello, I'm Sarah," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Vance nodded, politely handing his coat to Jason. "A pleasure, Mrs. de la Cruz. You have a lovely home." "Thank you," Jason interrupted, quickly tossing the expensive coats onto the bench instead of hanging them properly. We've put a lot of work into it. Please step into the dining room. We have a wonderful evening planned." He led them down the hall, walking with a swagger that bordered on comical. He was leading the lion into the den, convinced he was the tamer. I waited a moment, counting to 3, and then picked up the heavy tray of appetizers. I took a deep breath, centering myself. The apron I wore was stained with a drop of wine, a badge of the servant role I was playing. I pushed the swinging door open into the dining room. The guests were just taking their seats. Jason was pulling Vance's chair out for him, chattering aimlessly about the local real estate market. Sarah was hovering near the sideboard, looking like she wanted to fade into the wallpaper. I walked toward the table, my footsteps silent on the rug. "Here we are," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. "Some warm appetizers to start." Jason whipped around. His eyes went wide with horror. He had explicitly told me to be invisible, to serve and vanish. Instead, I was standing right next to Mr. Vance, holding the tray at eye level. For a second, the mask slipped. The charming host vanished, replaced by the tyrant who had slapped me that morning. He forgot Vance was there. He forgot the deal. He only saw my defiance. "Old man," he snapped. His voice was a harsh whisper that carried perfectly in the silent room. "I told you to wait in the kitchen. Put that food down and get out. You are not needed here." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The room went dead silent. Jason realized his mistake instantly. He froze his face, flushing a deep, ugly color. He turned slowly toward Vance, a nervous laugh bubbling up in his throat. "I apologize, Mr. Vance. My father-in-law he's a bit confused sometimes. We try to keep him busy with little tasks, but he forgets his place." He glared at me again, his eyes promising punishment later. "Go on, Henry, back to the kitchen." I didn't move. I didn't lower the tray. I looked at Jason, and then I turned my gaze to Arthur Vance. Vance wasn't looking at the food. He wasn't looking at Jason. He was looking at me, his face pale, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. Slowly, he pushed his chair back and stood up, ignoring Jason completely. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a sudden electrical tension. Jason looked between us, confused, his panic rising. "Mr. Vance?" Jason asked, his voice shaking. "Is something wrong?" Vance didn't answer him. He took a step toward me, his eyes locked on mine. "Henry," he whispered. The name hung in the air like thunder. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man, and Jason looked like he was already suffocating under the weight of it. Arthur Vance didn't wait for a response. He moved around the massive mahogany table with an urgency that bordered on panic, pushing his chair back so hard it screeched against the floorboards. To Jason's absolute horror, Vance didn't just walk toward me. He practically bowed, his posture shifting from commanding CEO to respectful subordinate in the blink of an eye. "Mr. Sterling, sir," he said, his voice trembling with genuine disbelief. "I apologize. I didn't realize. Why are you serving food? I was under the impression you were inspecting the vineyards in Tuscany. The last board report said you were fully retired living in Europe." I set the appetizer tray down on the table with a soft clink. My eyes never left Jason's face. The colour had drained from my son-in-law's skin, leaving him a sickly shade of grey. His mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock, desperate for air that wasn't coming. "Plans changed, Arthur," I said, my voice smooth and controlled. "I decided to stay closer to family, to see how my investments were being managed up close. Jason finally found his voice, though it was an octave higher than usual and cracking with hysteria. "Mr. Vance, you must be confused. This is Henry. He's my father-in-law. He's just a carpenter. He built the deck in the backyard. He's not—" He stopped because Vance turned and shot him a glare so withering it could have peeled the paint off the walls. The warmth vanished from Vance's face, replaced by the cold, hard steel of a man who ran $1 billion empire. "Just a carpenter." Vance repeated the words as if they were an insult to his intelligence. "You ignorant fool. This man isn't just a carpenter. Henry Sterling is the reason you're sitting in a chair that cost more than your first car. He is the founder of Sterling Heritage. He is the visionary who revolutionized sustainable manufacturing in this country." See, Vance pointed a finger at me, but his eyes remained locked on Jason. "He is the greatest mentor I've ever had. Everything I know about quality, about integrity, about business, I learned in his workshop 40 years ago when I was nothing but a kid sweeping the floor. And more importantly, he is the largest individual shareholder of the Vance Group. He owns the controlling interest in the very company you are trying to beg for money." The silence that returned to the room was different this time. It wasn't heavy. It was explosive. Sarah let out a small, strangled sound, her hands flying to her throat as she stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. She looked at me as if she was seeing a stranger, as if the father she had treated like a servant for 3 years had suddenly taken off a mask to reveal a king. Jason looked like he was going to vomit. He gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles, his eyes darting frantically between Vance and me, trying to process the sheer magnitude of his mistake. The man he had slapped. The man he had called a parasite. The man he planned to dump in a state institution. That man owned him. Literally owned him. I picked up the bottle of wine from the sideboard, walked over to Vance's glass, and poured a generous amount, the deep red liquid swirling in the crystal. "Please sit down, Arthur," I said calmly. "My son-in-law went to a lot of trouble to organize this evening. It would be a shame to let the food get cold." Vance hesitated, looking at me with concern. "Sir, if you are being mistreated here, if this man—" "Sit down," I repeated softly, but with the tone of command I hadn't used since the Marine Corps. "We have business to discuss." Vance sat down slowly, his eyes still full of questions. I walked around the table to the head, where Jason was still standing frozen in his nightmare. I stopped right next to him. I could smell the fear radiating off him in waves, a sour, acrid scent that overpowered the aroma of the stew. "I believe you're in my seat, Jason," I whispered. He bolted from the chair so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet, stumbling backward until he hit the sideboard. I pulled the chair out and sat down, settling into the head of the table. I adjusted my napkin, placing it over my lap. "Now," I said, looking at the stunned faces of my family and the confused reverence of my business partner. "Let's begin." I untied the knot of the stained apron at my waist, the fabric sliding away to reveal the suit I had worn underneath. A charcoal grey wool that fit me as perfectly today as when I addressed the shareholders a decade ago. I folded the apron carefully, placing it on the sideboard next to the untouched appetizers, a symbolic shedding of the servant's skin. Jason was shaking against the wall, watching me with the eyes of a cornered animal as I settled into the high-back chair. The leather creaked softly, a sound of authority reclaiming its throne. "You seemed worried about your presentation earlier, Jason," I said, my voice cutting through the suffocating silence of the room. You told me this dinner was about closing a deal, about showing Mr. Vance the reality of your assets. I think that's an excellent idea. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and placed it on the polished wood of the table. Let's look at the assets. I tapped the screen. The massive television on the wall behind me flickered the serene image of the Tuscan countryside, vanishing instantly. In its place, a high-definition video feed materialized. The timestamp in the corner read 7:14 a.m. that very morning. The audio was crystal clear, amplified by the surround sound system Jason had been so proud of. The sound of porcelain shattering exploded into the room, making Sarah jump in her chair. On the screen, everyone watched as the Jason from 12 hours ago lunged across the kitchen island. They saw the rage on his face, the vein throbbing in his neck, and then, with sickening clarity, they saw the slap. The sound of flesh striking flesh echoed off the dining room walls. A sharp, brutal crack that seemed to hang in the air long after the moment passed. In the video, my glasses went flying across the floor. I stumbled backward, and the Jason on the screen leaned over his 75-year-old father-in-law and spit venom. You useless old parasite. Do you have any idea how much that plate cost? That antique was worth more than your entire miserable existence. The video froze on a close-up of Jason's snarling face. Arthur Vance slowly turned his head to look at Jason. The expression on his face wasn't anger. It was something much worse. It was the absolute icy disgust of a man looking at something rotten. You hit him, Vance said, his voice barely a whisper, but carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. You hit the man who built the foundation you're standing on. Jason tried to speak, his hands flapping uselessly in front of him. Mr. Vance, please. It's out of context. He was being difficult. He broke an antique. It was a moment of... It was an aggression. I interrupted, my eyes cold. But that's just the character reference, Jason. Let's move on to the business proposal. I tapped the phone again. The video switched. This footage was grainier, taken from the hidden camera in the study's smoke detector 3 nights ago. It showed Jason sitting at his desk, a single lamp illuminating a stack of legal documents. He wasn't alone in the video. He was on speakerphone, with someone a voice that sounded rough and impatient. I need more time, Jason pleaded in the video. The old man is stubborn, but I have a plan. I'm putting him in a home next week. Once he's declared incompetent, I get power of attorney. On the screen, Jason picked up a pen and pulled a document toward him. The camera zoomed in digitally. A feature Jason had insured was top of the line. The document was an application for a second mortgage on this very house. But the house is in your wife's name, the voice on the phone grunted. She needs to sign. She'll sign whatever I tell her to, Jason scoffed in the video. But just in case. The room watched in horrified silence as Jason practiced a signature on a scrap of paper. He wrote Sarah's name over and over again. Then, with a steady hand, he signed the mortgage document. There it is, Jason said in the video, holding up the forged paper. Done. The house is collateral. You'll have your money once the bank processes this. I paused the video. Sarah was making a sound I had never heard before, a low, wounded whimper. She was staring at the screen, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She looked at her husband, not with fear this time, but with the devastating realization that the man she slept next to was a predator who had sold her security to pay a gambling debt. You forged my name, she whispered, her voice cracking. You told me the house was paid off. You told me we were safe. Jason lunged toward the table, panic overriding his senses. That's a lie. That's a deep fake. He's doctoring the video. Mr. Vance, you can't believe this. This old man is senile. He's trying to frame me because I wanted to put him in an assisted living facility. I didn't even flinch. I simply reached for the silver tray I had placed on the sideboard. I lifted the crystal bowl of dessert and pulled back the linen napkin, revealing the thick manila envelope underneath. I tossed it into the centre of the table. It slid and stopped right in front of Arthur Vance. "Open it, Arthur," I said. Vance opened the envelope. He pulled out the forensic accounting report, the bank statements from the Cayman Islands, and the police report regarding the embezzlement at Jason's previous firm. He scanned them quickly, his professional demeanour snapping into place. "This isn't just mismanagement, son," Vance said, peering at Jason over the rim of his glasses. "This is a federal indictment waiting to happen. You've been laundering money through shell companies to pay illegal gambling debts, and you are planning to use my investment fund to cover your tracks." Jason was hyperventilating. He backed toward the door now, his eyes darting around the room looking for an exit. "You can't prove that," he stammered. "This is all circumstantial. You have no jurisdiction here. You're just a businessman. I'll sue you. I'll sue all of you." He turned to the woman sitting next to Vance. Emily, the woman he had dismissed as a secretary. "And you," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You're a witness to this harassment. I want your name. I'm going to have you fired." Emily stood up. She didn't look scared. She didn't look confused. She moved with a lethal, fluid grace that made Jason take a step back. She reached into her sleek black purse, and she didn't pull out a notepad. She pulled out a badge. She flipped it open. The gold shield caught the light of the chandelier. "Special Agent Emily Turner, FBI, Financial Crimes Division," she said, her voice calm and authoritative. "And I'm not a witness to harassment. Jason, I'm the lead investigator on the RICO case we're building against the syndicate you've been borrowing money from." Jason hit the wall. His legs gave out and he slid to the floor, a puddle of expensive fabric and ruined ambition. "Henry contacted us 3 weeks ago." Emily continued walking around the table to stand over him. "He provided the initial tip on the laundering. We've been tracking your transactions ever since. But tonight you gave us everything we needed. The forgery, the taped confession, the intent to defraud a federal investor. You're done." I looked at Jason huddled on the floor of the dining room he had bought with stolen money. He looked small. He looked pathetic. The monster who had terrified my grandson and slapped my face was just a greedy, scared little boy. I stood up and walked over to him. I looked down at him, my face impassive. "You told me to serve you what you deserved, Jason," I said quietly. I pointed to the badge in Emily's hand and the pile of evidence on the table. "Bon appétit." The silence that followed Emily's declaration was shattered by the wail of sirens cutting through the cold night air outside. The sound grew louder and more urgent with every second, piercing the thick walls of the house Jason had bought with dirty money. It was the sound of reality crashing into his illusion. Emily didn't wait for the uniformed officers to burst through the front door. She moved with the efficiency of a predator securing her prey. She knelt down, grabbed Jason's wrist, and twisted it behind his back. The movement was so fast and precise that Jason didn't even have time to struggle before his face was pressed into the hardwood floor he was so proud of. The metallic ratchet of the handcuffs closing was a sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the dining room. It was a cold, final sound. The click, of consequences arriving. Jason let out a howl of rage and pain that didn't sound human. It was the sound of a man watching his entire life disintegrate in real time. Two uniformed officers burst into the room, their radios crackling with static. They moved to help Emily, hauling Jason up off the floor. He was a mess. His expensive suit was wrinkled and covered in dust from the floorboards. His hair was wild, plastered to his forehead with sweat. The arrogance that had defined him just hours ago was gone, replaced by a savage, terrified desperation. As the officers gripped his arms, Jason looked around the room, searching for a scapegoat. His eyes landed on Sarah, who was still sitting at the table, frozen in shock, tears streaming silently down her face. "This is your fault," Jason screamed, spitting the words at his wife. "You and your constant demands. You wanted the big house. You wanted the club membership. You wanted the lifestyle. I did this for you. I borrowed that money to keep you happy because you're nothing but a leech." Sarah flinched as if he had physically struck her. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but no sound came out. She just shook her head slowly, looking at the man she had shared a bed with for 10 years, as if he were a complete stranger. Jason wasn't finished. He thrashed in the officer's grip, twisting his head to glare at me. His eyes were filled with a hate so pure it was almost tangible. "And you planned this. You set me up, you old snake. You sat there in my house, eating my food, plotting against me. I should have thrown you out the window this morning instead of just slapping you. I should have finished the job." The officers tightened their grip, forcing him toward the door, but I held up a hand. "Wait!" The room fell silent, save for Jason's heavy, ragged breathing. I walked slowly around the table. I didn't rush. I moved with the weight of my 75 years and the authority of the position I had kept hidden for so long. I stopped directly in front of him. I looked at the red mark on his wrist where the handcuffs were biting in. I looked at the sweat on his upper lip. I looked into his eyes, which were darting back and forth, looking for an escape that didn't exist. I remembered the morning. I remembered the stinging pain in my cheek. I remembered the feeling of helplessness that had washed over me, the feeling that I was small and weak. But looking at him now, I realized I had never been the weak one. He was. He was weak because he thought power came from force. He thought authority came from fear. "You're right about one thing, Jason," I said, my voice low and steady, barely above a whisper, but reaching every corner of the room. "You slapped me this morning. You laid your hands on an old man because you thought you were untouchable. You thought that because you were younger, richer, and louder, you were the king of this world." I took a step closer, invading his space just as he had invaded mine in the kitchen earlier that day. "But you forgot the first rule of being a man. Never strike someone who can't hit back, unless you're prepared for the universe to hit back for them. You used your hand to hurt me when the sun was up. You used physical violence to silence the truth." I pointed to the badge hanging from Emily's neck, and then to the officers holding him. "But now the sun has set, and in the dark the rules change. You hit me with your hand, but tonight the law is hitting you back. And unlike me, the law doesn't leave bruises. It breaks." Jason stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The reality of his situation finally seemed to pierce the thick wall of his narcissism. He wasn't arguing with a father-in-law anymore. He was arguing with his fate. "Get him out of my sight," I told the officers. They started to drag him away. He wasn't yelling anymore. He just started to sob, a broken, pathetic sound that grated on the nerves. As they hauled him out the door, past the uneaten appetizers and the cold beef stew, he looked back one last time. He looked at the luxury home he was leaving, probably forever. He looked at the wife he had betrayed. And he looked at me. The old carpenter who had just dismantled his life with a dinner party. The front door slammed shut, cutting off his sobs. The silence that returned to the house was deafening. The sirens outside began to fade as the police cruisers pulled away, taking the cancer of this family with them. I turned back to the table. Mr. Vance was standing, buttoning his coat. He looked shaken, but there was a grim satisfaction in his eyes. "I'm sorry it had to end this way, Henry," he said quietly. "But you did the right thing. The company will cooperate fully with the investigation. We'll make sure every cent he stole is accounted for." "Thank you, Arthur," I said. "I appreciate you coming. And I apologize for the dinner. I'm afraid the beef is cold." Vance managed a small, tired smile. "Given the circumstances, I think I've lost my appetite. But Henry, please call me next week. We need to discuss your seat on the board. It's been empty for far too long." I nodded. "I will." Emily stepped forward. "We have a lot of paperwork to go through, Mr. Sterling, but for tonight the site is secure. We have agents monitoring his accounts. He's not going anywhere but a holding cell. You and your family are safe." Safe. It was a strange word. The physical threat was gone, yes, but looking at Sarah, who was still staring at the empty doorway where her husband had just disappeared, I knew the real work was just beginning. The storm had passed, but now we had to live in the wreckage. I walked the guests to the door, thanking them for their role in this painful theatre. As the deadbolt clicked, locking the cold night outside, I turned back to the hallway. I was alone with my daughter. The house felt massive and empty. The smell of the rich stew still hung in the air, a ghostly reminder of the celebration that never happened. I walked back into the dining room. Sarah hadn't moved. She was shaking her hands, gripping the tablecloth so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked small. She looked like the little girl who used to scrape her knees waiting for Dad to fix it. But I couldn't fix this with a band-aid and a kiss. This wound was too deep. And this time, she had to be the one to stop the bleeding. I walked toward her, my footsteps heavy on the floor. It was time for the second course of this meal, the course that tasted bitter, but was necessary for survival. It was time for the truth. The silence in the dining room was heavy, a physical weight pressing down on us. The police sirens had faded into the distance, taking Jason away. But the wreckage he left behind was still sitting at my table. Sarah sat frozen, her hands trembling in her lap, staring at the empty chair where her husband had been sitting just minutes ago. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped. Hairline fractures ran through her composure, threatening to shatter her completely. I stood by the sideboard watching her. My heart ached. Every instinct as a father screamed at me to go to her, to wrap her in my arms, to tell her everything was going to be okay, that Dad would fix it. I had been fixing it for 38 years. I fixed her scraped knees, her broken toys, her failed science projects. I paid for her mistakes, smoothed over her conflicts, and shielded her from the sharp edges of the world. And look where that had gotten us. I had raised a woman who stood by and watched her husband slap her elderly father across the face, and then blamed the father. I had raised a mother who was so paralyzed by fear and dependency that she allowed a man to threaten her own son with military school just to keep a secret. If I comforted her now, if I told her it was okay, I wouldn't be saving her. I would be condemning her. I would be confirming that she was a victim who needed rescuing, instead of a woman who needed to find her own strength. Sarah slowly turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were bloodshot, smudged with ruined mascara. She slid out of her chair, her movements uncoordinated and clumsy, and dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor. She didn't try to get up. She just stayed there, kneeling between the table legs, her head bowed. "Dad?" She sobbed, the word breaking in the middle. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know about the forgery. I didn't know about the embezzlement. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." She reached a hand toward me, gripping the hem of my trousers like a drowning swimmer reaching for a lifeline. I looked down at her. I didn't pull away, but I didn't reach down to help her up either. I let her stay there on her knees. It was a cruel image, perhaps, but a necessary one. She needed to feel the hardness of the floor. She needed to feel the reality of her position. "You didn't know about the forgery, Sarah," I said, my voice low and steady, devoid of the warmth she was begging for. "I believe you. But you knew about the slap. You saw him hit me. You saw the blood on my lip, and you told me to go to my room so I wouldn't embarrass him." She flinched, dropping her head lower, her shoulders shaking with fresh sobs. "I was scared," she whispered. "He was so angry. I just wanted to keep the peace." "Peace is not the absence of conflict, Sarah," I said sternly. "Peace is the presence of justice. And there hasn't been justice in this house for a long time. You traded your dignity for a luxury car and a country club membership. You traded your father's safety for a quiet morning. And worst of all, you were ready to trade your son's well-being to protect a criminal." She looked up at me, her face twisting in anguish. "No, never, Leo. I love him." "Love is action, not a feeling," I fired back. "Jason threatened to send him away. You knew he was scared. You saw the bruises I found, and you did nothing. You let the wolf live in the sheep pen because you were afraid of being alone." I took a step back, breaking contact with her hand. I walked over to the table and picked up the manila envelope Vance had left behind. The evidence of Jason's crimes, and the proof of my own hidden life. "This house," I said, gesturing to the high ceilings and the expensive art. "This house was bought with lies and maintained with stolen money. Jason forged your signature to max out the mortgage. Technically, it's in foreclosure as of this morning. Or it would be if I hadn't intervened." Sarah's eyes widened. "We're losing the house." I didn't correct her. "You are losing the house. I am reclaiming it." I walked back over to her, standing tall. "I used my connections and my capital to buy the debt from the bank this afternoon. As of this moment, I am the sole owner of this property." She let out a breath of relief, a small, hopeful smile touching her lips. "Oh, thank God. Thank you, Dad. I knew you'd save us. We can stay here. We can make it work. I'll be better. I promise." I shook my head slowly. The hope on her face was painful to witness because I was about to crush it. "No, Sarah, aren't you listening?" I said. "I didn't say we were keeping it. I said I reclaimed it, not that you would stay in it." The smile vanished. "What?" "This house is going into an irrevocable trust for Leo," I declared, my voice hard as iron. "It will be his when he turns 25. Until then, it will be rented out, and the income will go to his education fund. You are not going to live here. But where will I go? She stammered, panic rising in her voice. I don't have any money. Jason emptied our accounts. I haven't worked in 10 years. I have nowhere to go. I know, I said, and that is exactly why you have to leave. You've gotten comfortable being helpless. You've relied on men to provide for you, to define you, to tell you who you are. First me, then Jason. You went from my house to his house without ever standing on your own 2 feet. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They weren't the keys to this mansion. They were the keys to a small 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood across town. I had rented it yesterday in my name, paying the first 6 months of rent. It was clean, safe, and completely devoid of glamour. I tossed the keys onto the table. They landed with a loud clatter next to the cold stew. That's an apartment on 42nd Street, I said. The rent is paid for 6 months. There's furniture, there's a fridge, there's a bus stop on the corner. That's all you get. Sarah stared at the keys like they were a venomous snake. Dad, you can't be serious. You have millions. Mr. Vance said you were the majority shareholder. You could buy me a house. You could give me an allowance. Why are you punishing me? I'm not punishing you, I said, my voice cracking slightly with the emotion I was holding back. I'm teaching you. I'm doing the job I should have done 20 years ago. I'm forcing you to grow up. I leaned in, bringing my face closer to hers, making sure she heard every word. For the next 2 years, I will not give you a single red cent. Not for clothes, not for food, not for a car. You are going to get a job, any job. You are going to wake up early, work hard, and pay your own bills. You are going to learn what $1 is actually worth when you have to sweat for it. She started to protest, but I cut her off. If you need food, you will earn it. If you need clothes, you will buy them at a thrift store. I will pay for Leo's school and his medical needs directly, but not 1 penny will pass through your hands. You have 6 months of free rent to get on your feet. After that, you are on your own. But I can't, she whimpered. I don't know how. Then you will learn. I roared the volume of my voice, making her jump. You are smart, Sarah. You are capable. You just forgot because it was easier to be weak. You are going to learn to respect yourself. And you are going to learn that you don't need a husband or a father to survive. You only need yourself. I straightened up, adjusting my jacket. I'm taking Leo to my hotel tonight. You pack your things. Take what you need, but leave the expensive furniture, the art, the jewelry Jason bought with stolen funds. That's evidence. You leave tomorrow morning. I turned my back to her and walked toward the doorway. It was the hardest thing I had ever done in my life. Every step away from her felt like tearing off a limb. I could hear her crying behind me, a desolate, frightened sound. But I kept walking. I had to be strong enough for both of us. I stopped in the doorway and looked back one last time. She was still kneeling, clutching the keys to the small apartment in her hand. One day, Sarah, I said softly, one day you'll understand that this is the only way I could save you. You have to save yourself first. I stepped out into the hallway and headed upstairs to get my grandson. The dinner was over, the lesson had begun, and for the first time in a long time, I had hope. Not the soft, easy hope of a dream, but the hard, gritty hope of a man who knows that the fire that burns the forest is also what allows the new seeds to grow. The morning mist rolled off the surface of the lake, creating a blanket of silence that felt sacred. I sat at the end of the wooden dock, my legs dangling over the water, holding a fishing rod with a loose, easy grip. Beside me, Leo sat with his own rod, his eyes focused intently on the red and white bobber floating in the stillness. He wasn't drawing lions to hide from the fear anymore. He was learning patience. He was learning that good things come to those who wait, not those who snatch. It's been exactly 1 year since the night the police took Jason away. 12 months since I served a dinner that destroyed a family in order to save it. Jason is currently serving the first year of a 10-year sentence for fraud and embezzlement. I haven't visited him. I have no intention to. He's a ghost, a bad memory slowly fading from my grandson's eyes. "I got one," Leo whispered, his voice full of a thrill that didn't need to be shouted. He reeled it in, a small but lively fish. I watched him gently unhook it and release it back into the water. He didn't need to keep it, he just needed to know he could catch it. Yesterday I drove past the bakery on 4th Street. The smell of yeast and sugar was thick in the air. Through the display window I saw Sarah. She was wearing a white apron covered in flour. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, sweat shining on her forehead as she kneaded a massive mound of dough. She looked tired. She had dark circles that makeup didn't cover because she wasn't wearing any. But when she looked up and saw me, she smiled. It wasn't the fragile, terrified smile of the woman who lived in the mansion. It wasn't the fake smile of a trophy wife trying to please a tyrant. It was a real smile, a tired, honest, and beautiful smile. She bought her own car last month. It's a used sedan with a dent in the bumper, but she paid for it with money she earned waking up at 4 in the morning to bake bread. She pays her own rent, buys her own groceries, and for the first time in her life, she walks with her head held high. She's no longer afraid of losing everything because she knows she can build it back with her own 2 hands. I walked into the bakery and ordered a coffee. She tried to give it to me for free. I put a $20 bill in the tip jar and told her that hard work deserves a reward. She laughed, and the sound was like music. We are rebuilding slowly, brick by brick. It's not perfect, but it's real, and reality is the only foundation worth building on. I looked at Leo, the sunlight catching the gold in his hair. I looked out at the vast, deep lake. I touched my cheek, the spot where Jason had slapped me a year ago. The physical pain was long gone, but the memory remained, a reminder of the moment everything changed. People often confuse kindness with weakness. They mistake silence for submission. They think that because you're old or quiet or patient, you're defenseless. They think morality is a soft blanket you hide under. They're wrong. Morality isn't weakness. It's the steel rebar inside the concrete. It's what keeps you standing when the world tries to knock you down. Sometimes, to win the war, you have to lose a battle. Sometimes you have to stand perfectly still and let a lesser man strike you. You have to take the slap. You have to swallow the insult. You have to let them think they've won, because while they're celebrating their petty victory, while they're drowning in their own arrogance, you are gathering your strength. You are sharpening your truth. You are prepping the main course. And when the moment is right, you don't need to shout. You don't need to use your fists. You just need to serve the truth, because the truth is the only punch that knocks them out for good. And believe me, nothing tastes sweeter than a justice you cooked up yourself. If there's one thing this old carpenter has learned in 75 years, it's that real power doesn't need to roar, it whispers. My son-in-law thought strength was a loud voice and a heavy hand. He thought wealth was a shield for his cruelty, but he learnt the hard way that character is the only currency that truly matters in the end. Don't let anyone confuse your silence with surrender or your kindness with weakness. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the keys. Protect your dignity. Protect those who can't protect themselves. And never be afraid to walk away from a table where respect is no longer being served. If you enjoyed seeing justice served cold, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of a life well lived. And tell me in the comments below, have you ever had to teach someone a lesson they would never forget?